It's a little bit past 7 o'clock, and as I mentioned earlier, it's a little after 10 o'clock, Brent's time. So I do want to be respectful of our speaker. So with that, I'd like to call upon our Sovereign Grand Inspector General, illustrious brother Al Jorgensen, to welcome our speaker tonight. And then Brent, as soon as that's done, I've given you permission to go ahead and share your presentation. So illustrious brother Al, would you be so kind?
Thanks, Jim.
Thank you very much, Jim. It's a real honor and pleasure to welcome Brent to the Orient of Washington. As was mentioned earlier, we have our 13 valleys represented by brothers from across the state. Looking forward to your presentation. But for the brothers that are in attendance tonight, I actually, Dr. illustrious brother Brent Morris, 33rd degree Grand Cross, really needs no introduction, as all of you receive your copy of the Scottish Rite Journal on a bi-monthly basis, and consequently he is the editor of that particular document, and we enjoy it a great deal. Brother Morris has presented at a number of events that many of us have attended, such as the leadership conferences from across from the Supreme Council, and it's really a pleasure to have him with us tonight. So thank you, Dr. Morris, for being with us, and we look forward to your presentation.
Illustrious brother Al, thank you very much for those words. Brethren, first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to try to share screen, and if that goes well, I click here, and that's the screen I want to share. Technology is wonderful when it works. And now let's see if I click here.
Illustrious sir, we can see your screen. You're all good.
Okay. There we go. 6 stages of the evolution of U.S. Freemasonry. When I spoke to you a few weeks ago, I talked about the evolution, or it was a timeline of high degree Masonry. So you could see how high degree Masonry evolved from 1725, which was the first appearance of the first high degree, and that was the Master Mason's degree. And the Grand Lodge adopted it. The Grand Lodge liked it so much it adopted it. And then after that, the high degrees more or less were not ignored and allowed to develop independently. And so I took you from 1725 to 1801. And now what I'm going to do is tonight we're going to talk about specifically the way the high degrees evolved in the United States. And there were 6 distinct stages, almost non-overlapping, almost entirely separate from each other. And I have found when looking at something like this, if you just make a timeline, if you just lay it out, patterns suddenly appear to you and you say, oh, I get it. Well, what we're going to see with the evolution of the high degrees of U.S. Freemasonry, or more correctly, this is U.S. Freemasonry. Masonry or ladies Freemasonry or side degrees or whatever. It's a huge Masonic family. When you join, you are presented with a dozen doorways that you can open and explore. And so I think that the smart way to look at American Freemasonry is to look at it as a palette, and you get to pick which color from the palette you want to use, as opposed to saying you're limited to just one color. And if you want another one, you have to leave and go next door to someplace else. We're all on the same palette. So let's look at stage 1, and that's the evolution of the Grand Lodges. This starts in 1733 with the first lodge in Boston, Massachusetts. Now, I want to it's pretty safe saying this up in Washington State. What I'm about to say can cause all kinds of problems near Pennsylvania, and I'm only about 45 minutes away from Pennsylvania, because Pennsylvania has this book that they call Liber B. It's written on the spine, Liber B, Book B, which implies that there's a Liber A. I mean, why would you call a book Liber B unless you had a Liber A? And in there is it's a ledger book, and it says that on June 29th, Benjamin Franklin paid $30 dues in arrears. Well, they were paying their dues every 6 months, so that means that Benjamin Franklin paid his dues for I'm sorry, this was 1730, he paid his dues, June 1730. So in January 1st, 1730, or December, sometime in December of 1729, Franklin owed his dues. So Pennsylvania claims this is evidence that we are the oldest Freemasonry in the United States, dating from 1730. Massachusetts comes back and say, we're the oldest Freemasonry in the United States because we have a charter dated 1733. Show us your charter, Pennsylvania, and we'll yield, otherwise shut up. Well, you just don't want to be in the room when that discussion goes on. So, but I lean towards the Massachusetts argument that they have a charter, it's the first chartered lodge in the United States, 1733. So that's the beginning of Freemasonry in the United States. It's the beginning of the first Blue Lodge, the first Craft Lodge, and then from there the Grand Lodges arose. Now in 1776, as we all know, that's when the Declaration of Independence occurs. That's essentially political and Masonic independence. Some of the Grand Lodges had already essentially started operating independently. The others weren't quite sure, and their attitude was sort of, well, excuse us, sirs, if you don't mind, we think we're going to declare independence if that doesn't bother you too much, and if you're okay with that, then we'll go ahead on our own way and not check back with you, but only if that's okay with you. So it's sort of amusing the way that I presented a paper in Quattro Coronati Lodge that I called the Polite Revolution. And it looked at the evolution of the 13 colonies, or the revolution of the 13 colonies. And some of the revolutions were really just very, very polite. You know, you'll excuse us, but we really don't think we have to answer to you anymore. It's been very nice being subservient to you, but now we're on our own. Thank you very much and have a good day. That's hardly revolutionary language. Well, I'm going to declare that the first stage of growth ends in 1806. And that's when the Grand Lodge of Delaware is created. And that is the last of the 13 colonies to create their own independent Grand Lodge. So you can see that it took Delaware 30 years after the Declaration of Independence before they declared themselves independent from the Grand Lodge of England. So we have the first growth from 1733 to 1806, and that is the creation of the Grand Lodges, the foundation of the Masonic structure in the United States. Now this is where we get a little overlap. And we're going to take a little pause here, because history is not divided into very neat and tidy compartments. There's overlap, there's a little merging together. And we need to talk about Prince Hall Masonry. In 1775, Lodge 441 of the 38th Regiment of Foot initiated Prince Hall in a total of 15 free African Americans in Boston Harbor, on an island in Boston Harbor. And they went on and applied for a charter. In 1784, they got a warrant for African Lodge 459, and they operated as a lodge under the Grand Lodge of England. Now, the Grand Lodge of Massachusetts declared its independence from the Grand Lodge of England. They formed its own Grand Lodge, and the African Lodge 459 never joined them. Now, to be on the up and up, St. Andrew's Lodge never joined the Grand Lodge of Massachusetts either, at least not at the beginning. And St. Andrew's Lodge is a very famous lodge. They held the most famous meeting of a lodge that was never held. And that was the evening of the Boston Tea Party, where they wrote in the minute books, not enough members present for a quorum, meeting canceled. And so neither African Lodge nor St. Andrew's Lodge are affiliated with the Grand Lodge of Massachusetts. Now, why didn't African Lodge 459 affiliate with the Grand Lodge of Massachusetts? Well, I think it goes back to something that we all learned when we were teenagers. If you knew that your parents were going to say no, you just didn't ask them the question. You didn't bring it up. If they knew that if they weren't going to be happy with you going out that weekend, you didn't ask them. So if the members of African Lodge 459 had a pretty good feeling that their request was going to be turned down, well, don't ask. Just continue to operate the way they were and remain affiliated with England. So they did this for some 40 years, for 43 years. And then in 1827, they declared their independence. Now, what you had was a perfect storm. You had a confluence of events. In 1813, the Grand Lodge of Ancients and the Grand Lodge of Moderns merged together to create the United Grand Lodge of England. And someone in the administrative offices of the Grand Lodge said, "We don't have any lodges left in America, do they? Haven't they all, formed their own Grand Lodges?" Yeah, I'm sure you're right. There can't possibly be another Grand Lodge, a subordinate lodge left in the United States. Well, great. We'll just declare them all cut loose. So the Grand Lodge of England declared all lodges in the United States no longer affiliated with the United Grand Lodge of England. Well, here's poor African Lodge 459 trying to be faithful and loyal, and they get cut loose. Well, the white Grand Lodges in the United States, and let's be honest, we're dealing with an issue of racism that was going on here. The white lodges didn't want to have anything to do with the black lodges. So in 1827, African Lodge 459 declared its independence. It published a notice in the newspaper, and it says, "We're not beholden to any other Grand Lodge. We are our own Grand Lodge and will act that way from henceforth." And so everything that I am talking about, the dates and all that I'm giving you, are essentially dealing with the white branch of Freemasonry. The black branch of Freemasonry followed suit. In a few cases, they were a step or two ahead. And so you have a parallel structure here. So I don't want to ignore all Masonry, but what I'll be talking with tonight is primarily mainstream Masonry. Oh, and then the final episode, not the final episode, but one of the very nice episodes in the history of Prince Hall Masonry is in 1989. The Grand Lodge of Connecticut recognized them, and starting from there, the Grand Lodges like dominoes fell over and started recognizing Prince Hall. And I think we're down now to only 7 Grand Lodges have not recognized Prince Hall Masonry yet. So it's, an unfortunate situation, and a brotherhood of man, something like race should not get involved, but we're people, things like that happen. So that's the Prince Hall interlude. Now let's get back now to the evolution of Freemasonry. We saw from 1733 to 1806, I declare the Grand Lodge period. Well, now we have the growth of the York and Scottish Rites in the United States. We know that from, I think it's 1854, we have the first recorded conferral of the Royal Arch degree in the world. And that occurred in Fredericksburg Law. We know that the Royal Arch degree, and in some cases the Mark Master degree, was being conferred in the United States. It's not until 1798 that the General Grand Chapter of Royal Arch Masons creates itself. It was originally the General Grand Chapter of, I think, the northeastern states, and then it declared itself for the United States. All of the state Grand Lodges signed up except for Virginia and Pennsylvania. They both have a reputation of sort of being hard-headed and independent. But so in 1798, we now start the second phase of Freemasonry in the United States, and this is the creation of the high degrees. So you have the General Grand Chapter of Royal Arch Masons in 1798. 1801, just 3 years later, the Supreme Council creates itself in Charleston, South Carolina. And so you then get the Order of the Royal Secret, which was the 25-degree predecessor of the 33-degree Scottish Rite. You have the Order of the Royal Secret absorbed into the Scottish Rite, and then very slowly the Scottish Rite starts expanding. At the beginning, it's not nearly as popular as the York Rite is. 1813, you have the Supreme Council formed for the Northern jurisdiction. 1816, the Grand Encampment is formed. And this basically ties up the York and the Scottish Rite. In the United States, we essentially have 2 branches of high degree Masonry. In other countries, they're not divided this way. In England, the Mark Master Masons are completely independent from the Royal Arch and the Craft Lodge. The Royal Arch is completely independent from the Mark Masters, though it's intimately intertwined with the Grand Lodge. The Red Cross of Constantine in the United States is just like the Royal Arch. You go to any lodge meeting and someone says, well, first you have to be a Royal Arch Mason, but then they say, hey, would you like to join the Knights of the Red Cross instead of the Knights Templar? We have better parties than they do. Why don't you come join us? So it's not an invitation-only group in England. Anybody that is there, will get, strong-armed into joining. So in the United States, though, we basically had 2 branches of high degree Masonry. And that gets organized from 1798 to 1816. Now, I haven't thrown in the Council of Royal and Select Masters because they sort of evolved by fits and starts. The council degrees were originally conferred in the Royal Arch chapters. In Maryland, we spun off, we have records in the Grand Chapter of Royal Arch Masons where we spun off the Royal Master's degree and the Select Master's degree to create the Council of Royal and Select Masters. Now down in Virginia, they never did that. So the Royal Master's degree and the Select Master's degree are still conferred by the Grand Chapter of Royal Arch Masons. But now we have from 1733 to 1816, two of the major branches or two of the major parts of Freemasonry in the United States, the Craft Lodge, then the York Rite and the Scottish Rite. Now, we pause for an important historical interlude in this evolution, and that is the Morgan Affair. In 1826, a Mason named William Morgan had announced that he was going to publish a book exposing the secrets of Freemasonry. Now, one of the things that William Morgan had done, he was a active Mason. He seemed to have a very good memory because he was learning the lectures and teaching them. And they were going to start a new chapter of Royal Arch Masons in a neighboring town, and Morgan was going to be one of the charter members, and they erased his name from the charter. Some people have speculated that it was because of this that he got mad and decided to expose the secrets of Freemasonry. Other people point out that he apparently had a history of debt and working from one odd job to another, and he was short on money, so he thought he might make some cash by publishing the book. But what we know happens is that on September 11th, he's in jail for a debt. This was at a time when for a couple of dollars debt, you could be jailed if you hadn't paid it off. Well, a man showed up to pay off his debt, a local Mason, paid off his debt, escorted him outside, and then he was forced into a carriage. And he was heard screaming as he's forced in the carriage and the door is shut, "Help, murder, murder." Well, that is the last time that William Morgan is seen. He's said that he's taken to Fort Niagara, and then after that, no one knows what happens to him. Well, there have been multiple people confessing to the crime. Some people said that Morgan was wrapped in chains, taken out into the middle of the river and thrown overboard. Some have said he was given an amount of cash and was told, leave town and don't ever come back. I rather suspect that this was an attempt to frighten him that went bad, that they wanted to frighten him into not revealing the secrets, and he tried to escape or someone tried to stop him, and he was inadvertently, accidentally killed or accidentally wounded and died from his injuries. We don't know. His body was never found. And it's happened so often in the case, it wasn't the crime that caused so much problems, it was the cover-up. Because they had a grand jury investigation and they had a trial. Well, the sheriff was a Mason, the chairman of the jury was a Mason, the judge was a Mason, and when you know it, the Masons were found innocent. That just doesn't look good. That just doesn't look good. And so the first viable political third party was created, and that was the Anti-Masonic Party. And the Anti-Masonic Party reached its zenith in 1832 when William Wirt, I'm embarrassed to say a Baltimore Mason, was the candidate for the Anti-Masonic Party on the presidential ticket. Well, they didn't win, and after that, it basically fell apart. And one of the problems was professional politicians had taken over this protest movement, and so you had idealists that wanted to change the world, that wanted to make things better, that wanted to get rid of the evil Masons or wanted to get rid of corrupt politicians. Does any of this sound familiar? I think this is a song that we've been singing for a long time in the United States. So the professional politicians took over, and then the initial idealism that drove the Anti-Masonic Party wasn't around. But by 1841, Freemasonry reemerged. So it lasted about 15 years, and it was pretty crushing. In New York, about 90% of the Masons dropped out. We just had a paper presented in Maryland a few years ago, and the guy that presented the paper looked at the membership in the Grand Lodge during this period, 1826 to 1840 or so, and saw that the percentage drops were about the same as New York. Things got so bad in Vermont that the Grand Lodge of Vermont went belly up. It declared itself out of existence, and that was the end of Masonry. And then it was reorganized after 1841. But things reemerged in 1841. It tended to be a much more pious organization with much greater emphasis on piety and worship of God. And that has affected the character of Freemasonry today. So that's important to understand. It doesn't create any Masonic bodies, but is an important influence on Freemasonry. Well, now the next thing that happens in the growth of Freemasonry is the creation of the Androgynous orders. That's the groups for men and women. So you see in 1733, the first lodge is formed, and by 1806, you have the last of the original 13 colonies forms their grand lodges. You then have the Royal Scottish Rite form. So someone needs to mute their microphone, please. And then in 1850, Rob Morris, no relation to me, starts the Order of the Eastern Star. And it's a group for men and for women who are related to Freemasons. You all know this. I'm not telling you anything you know. Now, here's an interesting thing. I was interviewed by a reporter from the Washington Post many years ago. I made an offhand comment to him. I said, I don't understand why the Order of the Eastern Star was so popular if women were so subservient to men. And he said, oh, I understand it. It's abundantly clear. You were the first organization where a respectable woman could go out at night by herself. You were the first organization where a respectable woman got to run their affairs. They got to keep the books. They got to keep the minutes. They presided over the organization. And women invested all of their social capital in the Eastern Star. And then when more radical feminist organizations like co-masonry came around, American women had already invested all their social capital in what was the first radical feminist leap forward. Now, today we'd look back and might say some of the membership requirements are quaint, but at the time it was quite a radical leap forward. Well, let's say 1873, the Order of the Amaranth is formed. And then in 1894, the Order of the White Shrine of Jerusalem. I believe that these three organizations, the Eastern Star, the Amaranth, and the White Shrine, form the three largest androgynous organizations in the United States. Now, I know that New York State has an independent grand chapter of the Eastern Star, and it has some other independent co-orders, but I'm talking about national organizations. So we can now see a third group or third stage of growth in American Freemasonry. You have the Grand Lodges. They basically create themselves independent of anything else. You then have the Royal Arch Start in 1798 form a general grand chapter, little overlap with the Grand Lodges. You then have the Supreme Council, then you have the Grand Commandery of Knights Templar. You then have this pause, and the pause is caused in partially by the Morgan affair and the anti-Masonic period. And then you have this spurt of growth with androgynous orders, with groups for men and women. Now, the next thing that happens are the fun groups. There's a little overlap there with the women, but in 1872, the Shriners are formed. You know this, the ancient Arabic order, nobles of the mystic shrine. How exotic, how romantic. One thing to put this in context is we need to understand is that after the Civil War, starting in about 1870, the United States experienced what is known as the golden age of fraternalism. And so from the 50-year period from 1870 to 1920, 300 fraternal organizations are invented. 300 in a 50-year period. That's one every other month, nonstop for 50 years. Out of this period, we get the Shriners, 1872. We get the Elks, we get the Moose. We get the B'nai B'rith, we get the Woodmen of the World. All of these groups are created during the golden age of fraternalism. Now, with the Shriners come some androgynous groups also. They have the Daughters of the Nile. They then have the Jesters, the Kabiri, the Hillbillies. So there's a whole family of organizations connected to the Shrine. This all starts in 1872. 1889, just 17 years later, the Grotto's created in New York. You're familiar with the Grotto. It's the shrine, but when it was started, you didn't have to belong to the York or Scottish Rite. Connected to the Grotto, you have the Daughters of Mokana. And then in 1902, the Tall Cedars of Lebanon are formed. They're formed, I believe, in New Jersey. And then they've slowly spread westward from New Jersey. And they have the Cedarettes, which is their ladies group. So you see this whole group of organizations basically founded for the basis of fun. Freemasonry was kind of stiff and stodgy, especially after the Morgan affair. We came back and we're very pious, very conservative. We really got on the bandwagon for prohibition. And so Grand Lodge of Maryland didn't allow alcohol to be served at the Masonic functions until after 2000. So the Shriners, the Grotto, the Tall Cedars all formed a break from that. Then the next stage that happens is the youth groups. And in 1919, the Order of the Demolay is formed. I read a paper somewhere that said youth in the United States was invented in about 1900. That prior to 1900, that as soon as you were old enough to hold an implement, you were put out in the garden, weeding the garden or working on the plants. And so there wasn't any time for youth. And so it wasn't until American society had evolved to the point that we had leisure time and that we viewed childhood as a protected period of growth and development, that we were able to get into what we view today as childhood, as the expectation that you get to play, you get to grow, you get to try things out. And so in 1919, the Order of the Eastern Star is formed. The Order of the Demolay is formed. Next year, the Job's Daughters are formed. And 2 years after that, the Order of the Rainbow is formed. Bang, bang, bang. So what's interesting, if you compare this to biology, this is what biologists call punctured equilibrium. So you've got a ecology that's in equilibrium, and something causes a change. It's punctured. And so you have the Grand Lodges, and the guys that really liked Masonry wanted more to do with Masonry. So you then have the York Rite and the Scottish Rite. Well, now all the Masons have things to do to keep them busy. Then they realize, what are they going to do with their ladies? There's nothing for them to get involved with. So the ladies get involved. And so now we have ladies groups spread across the United States. Then they want to have some fun. So in 1872, you start the Shrine and the Grotto and the other groups. And then some 30 years after that, you get the youth groups all started. Now, again, I've got to put a footnote. Grand Lodge in New York has some independent youth groups. They have the Order of Triangles for girls, I believe. There was the Order of the Blue, not the Blue Key, but there have been a couple other boys groups, none as successful as Demolay. So now we have the groups that are serving our young people. And now we get to the sixth stage of growth that I call, and that's the invitational groups. The first invitational group to appear in the United States is the Red Cross of Constantine, and it's imported from England. And supposedly Robert Wentworth Little had found an old ritual book in the archives of the Grand Lodge of England. He dusted it off and then relaunched the Red Cross of Constantine. The fact is that the rituals of the Red Cross of Constantine were published in the anti-Masonic exposés of the 1820s after the Morgan affair. There was a group called the Order of the Holy Trinity, and portions of the Red Cross of Constantine ritual are copied verbatim. To be blunt, Robert Wentworth Little was a plagiarist, but he convinced everyone that he'd found these ancient rituals and that they were good. And so he sends it back to the United States, and so we have our first invitational group. 7 years later, the Royal Order of Scotland is started by Drummond in the north and Pike in the south. Pike was the first provincial Grand Master. That's another invitational group. Things really don't get started until 1930. So we've got these two groups, the Red Cross of Constantine, the Royal Order of Scotland. But the real launch of invitational groups comes in 1930. And this is when a young, eager Mason, J. Raymond Shute of Monroe, North Carolina, has basically done everything he can in Masonry, or everything he can do in Monroe. He's joined the Blue Lodge, he's been high priest of his commandery, he's been illustrious master of his council, and commander of his commandery. What's left to do? He invents the Knights of the York Cross of Honor. So as you know, to join the Knights of the York Cross of Honor, you have to have presided over all 4 of the bodies, and then you have to be invited. It's not just enough, it's not automatic. So then you're invited. So J. Raymond Shute invented the Knights of the York Cross of Honor. And in quick succession, he imports the Knights Templar priests, he imports the Allied Masonic degrees in 1932, he imports the Knight Masons. Those of you that have ever been to Masonic Week in Washington, D.C. will say, gosh, I recognize all of these groups. And then in 1957, there are lots of other these little groups created. The York Rite Colleges created. So all of these are ways to find more activity for Masonry. And I think something that the York Rite Masons did that created all of these groups, and I'll confess right now that I belong to a mess of them. I belong to the Red Cross of Constantine, to the Royal Order of Scotland, to the Allied Masonic degrees. I belong to a lot more. I'll consider my Masonic career completed when I'm invited to join the Ring-tailed Order of Raccoons. But until then, I'm keeping my fingers crossed. But what I think the York Rite Masons did is they shot themselves in the foot. In the Scottish Rite, if you become active in Masonry, or you become active in the Scottish Rite, you're basically active in your valley, and that's it. There just is not any opportunity for a Scottish Rite Mason to travel anywhere else in the United States and be active in Scottish Rite Masonry. There are a small number of exceptions, but basically, if you're active in the Scottish Rite, you're active in your valley, or you're not active at all. And the York Rite, on the other hand, once you become high priest and illustrious master and commander, you're then invited to join the KYCH, which takes you away from your home bodies. And then you can be invited to join the Allied Masonic degrees, and you can be invited to join the Knight Masons and the York Rite College. So each of these groups that you're invited to join pulls you away from your mother organization. So it's yet another meeting to go to during the month, yet another activity to be involved in. And all of it is pulling your energy away from the core organizations. I guess in 1930, when J. Raymond Shute really started this snowball rolling, there were enough men coming into the York Rite that you always had a fresh group of men waiting at the bottom of the line to move up and do something. And so it didn't hurt so much to move away. At least in Maryland and the East Coast, where I've been active in Masonry, that's no longer the case. The York Rite does not have this large body of men that are waiting to move in. And so I think that creating all these side groups has done a disservice as a whole to the York Rite. Now, what are some of the rest of the groups? I haven't covered everything. Like I said, everything doesn't fit neatly into independent standalone cabinets. In 1880, you had the Masonic Rosicrucians, the Societas Rosicruciana and Civitatibus Foederatis created. And that had started in Scotland, and then Robert Wentworth Little, who plagiarized the rituals for the Red Cross of Constantine, is the one responsible for the Masonic Rosicrucians. That used to be part of Masonic Week. 1905, you have the Syots or Skyots. I've never met anyone who belongs, so I don't know whether it's a hard C or a soft C. They started in California, and it's sort of like the Tall Cedars of Lebanon started in New Jersey. We have another fun group. 1917, the National Sojourners are formed for men who have been for Masons who have been in the military. A High 12 International, so now we have a luncheon club. This is sort of, to me, an amusing full circle. The Masons are created, and we create this elaborate social network based on ritual and symbolism. The Rotary, I think in 1906, the Rotary is formed. They essentially take the idea of Masonry, but focus on businessmen and drop the ritual. And now the High 12 takes the Rotary model. They create a luncheon club, but now it's for Masons, who want to have a luncheon club. So you see this growth occurring. 1928, you have the Philalethes Society created. That's a national research group for the guys that like to study and write papers and study history of Freemasonry. 1932, the Society of the Blue Friars is formed. Again, this is the J. Raymond Shute organization. This is for Masonic authors, and a new Blue Friar is selected each year from the published Masonic authors. 1953, I'm particularly fond of this one. This is the Invisible Lodge. To join the Invisible Lodge, you have to belong to the Society of American Magicians or the International Brotherhood of Magicians and be a performing magician. I joined the Invisible Lodge, I think it was 1976. And so I've been a member of the Invisible Lodge since then. I worked my way through college as a performing magician. So there's motorcycle groups, there's a trailer camping group. There are all kinds of groups basing their membership on Freemasonry. And I think what we're seeing here actually is part of the strength of Freemasonry, not a weakness. When you become a Mason, you have so many ways to be involved and participate. And you may not be attending your local Blue Lodge, but by golly, you're paying your dues. Because if you don't have a current Blue Lodge dues card, I can't be a member of the Invisible Lodge. Now, what's going to happen next? I'm not sure. If I was sure what was going to happen next, I'd be selling stock market tips, or I'd be running a mutual fund. Maybe European concept lodges. This was an idea that was popular several years ago. The European Concept Lodge is a lodge that met with greater formality. They had a formal dinner after each meeting. They looked at great rigor in their operations. Following on that idea is the Traditional Observance Lodge. Again, it's much more formal. They also look at a much more introspective metaphysical approach to Freemasonry. Meditation, they're looking at ways that they can be, when they say traditional observance, what I think what they really mean, and I've said this to my friends that are in TO lodges, this is the tradition that you wish had been around when your grandfather was a Mason so you could be continuing it. And so you're going to pretend that that's the way it used to be. Well, it's not quite, but they're doing something different. And I give them credit for trying something different. A movement that I've seen certainly in the greater metropolitan Washington area is affinity lodges. And an affinity lodge means that the members are all connected by having something in common. We have in Maryland St. Florian's Lodge, which is for first responders in the fire department. There is in Washington, D.C., there is Colonial Lodge. That is for Masons that have an affiliation with George Washington University. It's mostly graduates. I'm a member because I was on the faculty at George Washington University. Just to show you what I think is the right spirit of things, when they started this lodge, you had to be affiliated with George Washington University. There was a Mason in Washington who said, hey, I was born in George Washington University Hospital. Does that count? Well, the founders of the lodge kind of scratched their head. They said, good enough. You're affiliated with George Washington University. You can join. And so this seems to be something that is popular. Certainly in Washington, there are a lot of language lodges. So you have a lodge that works in Armenian, a lodge that works in Turkish, Italian, Spanish, French. Once a year, they hold a very cool meeting in Washington where every officer with a speaking part speaks a different language. And so the worshipful master may open the lodge in Turkish, ask the senior warden his question. The senior warden will respond in French. The junior warden will speak Spanish. It's a situation where I don't understand any of the words, but I understand everything that's being said. And so that seems to tie the members together. There is an increase in internet gatherings. Look at what we're doing tonight. Quattro Coronati Lodge I belong to in London, the premier lodge of Masonic research, has been holding its meetings for the last year by Zoom. And so the presentation is made in a Zoom format. The question and answer occurs in a Zoom format. They have someone recording it. This is an opportunity for men to participate that haven't participated before. What else is going to happen? I don't know. I wish I were smart enough to do it, but brethren, that's the way I view the evolution of American Freemasonry. I will unshare my screen, and I'll be happy to answer any questions if you have.
as always, Brent, much appreciated. I'm gonna open it up. So it looks like Roger Nelson has his hand up.
Thank you, Most Worshipful. Dr. Morris, thank you for joining us this evening. I'm curious as to what social currents were at play that brought about the golden age of fraternal organizations in that 1870 to 1920 time period. And do you see any similar social currents beginning to stir now that might bring about a return to such a time?
Well, there were a couple of three things going on. The first one, don't forget, we had the American Civil War from 1861 to 1865. And so there was a desperate search for normalcy. And most of these new fraternal groups were founded in the North. The South had been economically destroyed. There was just no spare income. It was all they could do to survive. But in the North, they liked the idea of universal brotherhood. And one of the important factors behind the golden age of fraternalism is the large number of groups that offered insurance. Life insurance, death insurance, burial insurance. Groups like the Masons, the Oddfellows, the Pythians had orphanages, they had retirement homes. None of this was available from the government. None of this was available from your employer. So if you were a smart young man starting out, and not only did these groups not offer insurance, your employer or the government, there were no antibiotics either. So all it, and you might get an infection from which you wouldn't survive. So you wanted to look after your wife, you wanted to look after your children. So maybe getting the sick benefits from the odd benefits from the woodmen of the world made you feel secure. So one of the important things that was driving these fraternal groups was providing insurance, providing part of the social safety net. Well, starting in the 1920s, to lure people, to keep people in the job. We know that Social Security came in during the Great Depression, so that a lot of the cash and carry benefits that these fraternal groups offered are now being offered by employers and by the government. And to be perfectly honest, all I want is life insurance to become a member of a fraternal group. We wear regalia, we have rituals at the meetings. All I want is insurance. Thank you very much. So I don't think the same social currents are in place that existed 150 years ago.
Scott Thompson, I see your hand up.
Thank you, Jim. Thank you, Dr. Morris. I wanted to ask a question, and you didn't really address it specifically, but I had always heard that there was an influx in Masonic membership around the 40s and 50s and maybe into the early 60s, but after the 60s it kind of waned. I guess after World War II, there was a huge influx in people looking at Masonic or fraternal organizations. Does that does that ring true with your research and looking at trends throughout Masonic history?
The blunt answer is no. I have talk. You remember the last time I spoke, I said, "Story, invite me back." If you want to hear the story about initiations and growth after the wars, you want to see my statistical summary of Masonic membership. What happens is after World War I, there is indeed a huge spike in membership, a massive spike in membership. So we had about 10,000 lodges, and I think it was in 1921 we had 300,000 initiates. That's 30 men per lodge in the United States in every lodge. And that means in the small country lodges where maybe they're only initiating 10 or 15 city lodges. So there is a massive, massive spike in membership after World War I. After World War II, there is a spike in membership that lasts about 3 years. And initiations increase by 30%. They go up, they drop back down, and then they have a slow decline starting about 1949, 1950. And there's a gradual decline. The initiation rate has gradually about it's happened so slow. A pot of boiling water, because he'll jump right out. What you do is you put them in a pot of cold water. You put the pot of cold water on the stove, and you put it on, and you put on a little flame underneath it, and it slowly heats up. And that's how you boil a frog. Had there been a sudden overnight change in Masonic initiation practices, we would have done something. We said, oh my gosh, we've got to make a change. The changes have been slow, they've been incremental, they've been gradual. The initiation rate between 2020 and 2010 is not that big. It's dropped a little bit, a smidge, but not a huge change. And so we haven't done anything. So the short answer to your question is no, there was not a spike after World War II. There was after World War I, massive. And only a small spike, and it quickly went away after World War II.
Okay, I just want to quickly scan the room there. Richard Kovac, I see you have your hand up. And then John Lawson, you're next. So Richard, go ahead.
Dr. Morris, thank you so much for your presentation. I really appreciate it.
Sure.
I need to get with you afterward on your statistics, membership statistics. The reason I say that is because in our state, and I think it's happened in other states, the peak of Masonic membership in Blue Lodge, rather I should say the lodges in Grand Lodge, in the York Rite, Scottish Rite, occurred from 59 to 62. We had a tremendous peak right then and there. And that bubble carried over into the shrine, because remember at that time you had to be a member of York Rite or Scottish Rite to join the shrine. The shrine reached a peak of 971,000 members in the late 70s. They always thought they were going to reach 1 million. They never made it. It's been downhill ever since. And, you know, I'm still trying to figure out what is happening. We've missed 2 or 3 generations in between. They say it's, you know, we missed the people after the baby boomers. We missed the Gen Xers. We missed the millennials. And now we're missing the Gen Zers. But you know what? 1920 starts the Generation Alphas. There's a new generation coming up. People born in 1920 are called the Alphas because we ran out of alphabet letters, so now we're using the Greek letters, just like the hurricane system. So, do you have any recommendations, sir? How can we grab these people in the 21st century and make Masonry relevant to them so that they become part of this great organization?
Well, the first thing, let me comment. The numbers you give are very similar to the national numbers. The peak of Masonic membership, according to the Masonic Service Association, was 1959, 4,250,000. The peak of Scottish Rite membership is later. So the Scottish Rite and the Shrine persisted. I think the peak of membership of the Royal Archman started declining before the Blue Lodge. Blue Lodge peaked in 59, and the Scottish Rite and the Shrine peaked in 79. What you have to look at, and I urge you to get this book, it's Bowling Alone. Trying to think of the author's name. He's a Harvard professor. Sadly, he writes like a Harvard professor. What he points out, though, is that Americans have stopped joining chapter-based organizations. They don't join liberal left-wing organizations. They don't join conservative right-wing organizations. They're not joining the Boy Scouts. They're not joining the Girl Scouts. They're not joining anything. It's not the Masons. It is American society. He speculates 2 of the biggest causes is 1, home entertainment. We have better home entertainment today, more entertainment available to us. I'm sitting in front of a little laptop. I can see more things on my laptop than I could have dreamed of seeing 50 years ago when I first became a Mason. The other thing is changing in housing patterns. And it used to be that everyone lived and worked and shopped and worshiped and went to lodge in the same community. Well, today, where you live may may have nothing to do with where you worship or where you go to or where you work. It may be that you found a cheap home with a lot of land, or it may be they're good schools and you want your kids to grow up there, but you have no connection to the community otherwise. Putnam looks at all of this, and the important thing to keep in mind is if we're going to talk about why Masonic membership is failing and why we have failed to grasp, the generation X, Y, Z, alpha, beta, gamma, and so on, we also have to answer the question, how come the Rotary and the Kiwanis haven't done this? How come the Oddfellows haven't done this? The Oddfellows have lost more than 90% of their membership from 1900. The Oddfellows allow solicitation. The Oddfellows have gone co-ed. None of that has helped them. So it's something. We have to be careful of beating up on ourselves too hard. No one is joining anything, and we have to explain why don't people want to join a chapter-based organization. And I gave you one short explanation. The insurance features. The Masonic retirement home that we have in Maryland used to be quite an attractive draw to being a Mason, that you knew there was a safety net there, that if things went really bad, you could always go to the Masonic home. Well, now things have changed, and the baby boomers aren't ready to turn their keys over to the Masonic home when they move in 1975. They're still active. At age 75. And so they're still active. They're going to still be driving around, visiting family and friends, going on trips, up into their 80s. So the old business model that so many Masonic homes had, turn over all your assets and we'll care for you till you drop dead, doesn't work anymore. So it's a larger question, not why did the Masons fail? Why did every flavor of voluntary association in the United States fail?
So let's see. I see. So John Lawson. I'm sorry, Brent. Were you done with your answer?
Yeah. Yes.
Okay. So John Lawson, you're next, and then after you, Jack Rank.
Thank you, Jim, and thank you, Dr. Morris, again for being here. Just a thrill to have you with all your background and knowledge, and I so appreciate you being here, and it's good to see you again. My question revolves around an experiment that we've been doing locally since COVID, actually before COVID, but it turned into a Zoom type thing. And that was, we have a lot of young Masons and a lot of wannabe Masons that are, some of them have filled out their petitions, but they're left sort of floating out there. But they have built a real camaraderie around, esoteric type ideals. There seems to be a real interest, particularly with the younger men coming in who maybe, just as you had just said, they sort of rejected institutional forms that exist, but they're very interested in a better or more focused spiritual life, not necessarily a religious life. Masonry seems to be something that migrates people towards that, to say, how am I as a good man going to now become a better man? We find ourselves studying things like the Kabbalah, just as a general interest, not as an alternative form or anything, but to become familiar with some of these ideas, how they work and why they're there. Thinking back to particularly, Albert Pike mentioning in one of the degrees, I believe the 4th degree, about how Kabbalah is important in understanding Masonry, that type of thing. So the question I have for you, how do you see that fitting in to who we are as an organization? Do you think that's a good thing, bad thing? What about people like Wilmshurst in his book, The Meaning of Masonry, or Masonic Initiation, things of that type? What's your take on that?
Well, I absolutely agree with you that many of the young men that are joining Masonry today are attracted to the more esoteric side of Masonry. Now, that's not my cup of tea. I'm a mathematician, and while some people will claim that I get involved in esoteric and mystical activities, it's just mathematics. The type of thing that interests me is history and dates and social movements, not interpretations. But that doesn't mean there's not a place for it. I think that what a Grand Lodge would be smart to do is you want to appeal to every man that you have. If you have firemen that like the idea of going to a lodge meeting with other firemen, then have a lodge like St. Florian's Lodge in Maryland. That's a rotating lodge that travels around the state, meets in different locations, and the firemen and first responders can get together. Have the Grand Lodge set up a rotating seminar on esoteric topics, and I'm sure you can find a half a dozen guys, in your Grand Lodge that are willing to speak on that. And so we're going to talk about Kabbalah. We're going to talk about some of these mystical orders. You come in and look at meditation. What place does meditation have, and do it in a serious way, and then you're going to appeal to them. I've been a Mason. Come June 14th, it'll be 50 years. I got my entered apprentice degree on June 14th, 1971. Wow. So I've been around a while, and I've seen some changes occur. And one of the big changes I saw, I remember shortly after I joined, they wanted to have more activities where wives and family would come to meetings. And so they would have a dinner before the meeting for wives and family, or they wanted to make it more family friendly. And so there've been several attempts that are going on. The traditional observance movement, which became popular, I guess, 15 or 20 years ago, was something that they tried. There's an increased interest in esotericism. Go for it. The American Freemasonry has succeeded not because we offer only one flavor. We offer 87 different flavors. No, we offer 33 different flavors. and so when you become a Mason, if you don't find something that interests you, it's because you didn't look. I mean, for heaven's sake, if they've got an organization for Masons that are performing magicians, they've got a place for everybody.
Very good. Thank you so much. I appreciate that.
Thanks, Brent. And Jack Rank. Go ahead and unmute yourself. You'll be good to go.
Okay. Dr. Morris, it was an excellent presentation.
Thank you.
I'm of the age that I was born in the gap between the end of World War II and the beginning of the baby boomers in June of '46. So my high school class of '63 was kind of like the last class pre-boomer. The '60s had a counterculture revolution. The kids were revolting against their parents. If dad belonged to a lodge, I wasn't going to belong to a lodge. If dad belonged to the KFC, I wasn't going to belong to the KFC. And I see that as part of the start of the decline. I'm also very active in several veterans organizations, and we have been having a hard time getting the post-Vietnam veterans to join. The VFW did a survey several years ago, and the thing that popped up in the survey is the younger veterans wanted to do something other than go to a meeting, read the minutes, pay the bills, have a cup of coffee or whatever, and go home. They were looking to do something. The VFW posts that were succeeding were doing things outside of the posts, like participating in Habitat for Humanity, area cleanup, things like this, where the younger fellows could go out and actually do something. Do you see a way that type of approach could apply to Masonry, where other than just going to the meeting, opening, reading the minutes, paying the bills, closing the meeting, and going home, where we could get hands-on type of activities, I'll call it, for the younger generation that would make them interested in petitioning a lodge.
I think you may be onto something. And by the way, I remember the author of Bowling Alone is Professor Robert Putnam, and it came out in the year 2000. It's 20 years old, and supposedly this summer, the fact that the VFW is having difficulty getting membership, I haven't checked, but I'm sure the American Legion is having trouble getting membership. The Kiwanis, the Rotary, you name it, they're all having trouble. Putnam points out to something larger than not having hands-on experience, that Americans don't want to belong to any kind of chapter-based organization. They're just not interested in that formality, that routine, whatever it is. They're living further and further out in the suburbs. They have to go. My commute in the morning is, I leave, when I was commuting to Washington, I've been teleworking, since the COVID lockdown. I leave the house at 6 o'clock and get into the desk by 7. Going home, I'd leave the office at 5 and get home between 6:30 and 6 commuting. And really the last thing that I wanted to do was to go to any kind of chapter meeting for any kind of organization. I mean, I've been a member of the Society of American Magicians for 50 years. I didn't want to leave the house. I wanted to get home, take my shoes off, get into a comfy pair of jeans and a t-shirt and just sit down and chill. And changes have occurred in American society. And yes, I think that we can do a lot to improve our situation by offering the type of programs, whether it's esoteric instruction, whether it is hands-on charitable work, whatever it is that we're doing. I think that's going to help. But we've got to look at this larger question. How come it didn't work for the Audubon Society? How come it didn't work for the American Legion, the VFW, the Boy Scouts, the Girl Scouts, the Rotary? Everyone is in the same boat, and we're all sinking.
Thank you. By the by, the advantage of these Zoom meetings is I left Spokane, Washington in 1999 and moved back to my hometown of Warren, Ohio. And that's where I'm attending from, is sunny downtown Warren. I kid the fellows in Spokane that I have probably one of the longest cable tows of 2,200 miles between Spokane and here.
That's awesome, Jack. So a couple of things. Illustrious Brother Jeremy Yielding has placed a link to Bowling Alone by Robert Putnam in the chat. So if anybody wants to purchase a copy of that, you're encouraged to do so. There's no commercial interest here because none of us, have a quote unquote library, so an Amazon store. So you're welcome to do that. Also, I'd like to make an announcement that my home lodge, Frank S. Line 313, is going to be hosting a Zoom meeting on Wednesday, featuring Illustrious Brother Jeremy. And he'll be making a presentation on the Masonic illusions found in Mozart's Magic Flute. So if anybody wants to join that, by all means, I have placed that info in the chat as well. Since there are no hands up, I'd like to call on two people specifically. First of all, I want to recognize the presence of our senior Grand Warden, Right Worship Brother Edward Woods. And Edward, did you have and I'm going to say it, question, comment, absurdity, or idiosyncratic remark for our illustrious guest?
I think I can come up with a word or two. Thank you, Most Worshipful. Dr. Brent, thank you again for the wonderful program. I don't know if you remember, but at the Conference of Grand Masters, I think I approached you and was one of the oddballs who brought a playing card for you to sign in reference to one of the books that you had written on mathematics and cards. I'm not a performing magician, but I am a shrine clown. I do play a lot with magic, and I am also a member of the Invisible Lodge. If I can just make a comment, I think in my mind, I sometimes wonder if we just kind of do a poor job of delivering the things that we promise to prospective members and people who are interested in Masonry, and feel like sometimes we're just not hitting the mark. I mean, somebody said, you know, doing other things out there with like soup kitchens and helping out with other community type activities. I almost wonder if maybe that is where we're missing our mark as Masons. I mean, we are Masons. I think that's the commonality that we all share, is belonging to a fraternal organization that we can enjoy in common. But I think outside of that, I wonder if it's really doing the community work and doing some of the other things as Masons is where we are maybe missing our mark. I don't know. Anyways, it's given me some things to think about. Thank you, Dr. Brent, and most worshipful Jim.
Thank you. And then, of course, basically, for all intents and purposes, last word, illustrious Brother Al.
Thank you, illustrious Brother Jim and illustrious Brother and Dr. Brent Morris. We do thank you for your presentation this evening. It certainly has engendered a great deal of discussion on a very wide range of topics, and ones that we probably ought to be thinking about pursuing further as we come out of this COVID-19 situation, if you will, and we come back together and meet as brothers, and we're able to shake hands and greet each other in person. I know this is something that is near and dear to all the hearts of all the brothers that I've been in touch with, but events like this evening and having a really tremendous presentation as we've received is something that will stir, I think, a great deal of discussion as we come back in those areas. So, Dr. Morris, again, thank you very much for a really top flight presentation as always, and I'm only sorry we didn't get to see some of your prestidigitation as you've done in the past. So good luck to you. Stay well and be safe.
Thank you. Thank you.
Brother Nall, thank you so very much for joining us this evening. Again, illustrious sir, as always, it's an absolute pleasure to join us and that you joined us. Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye.
Good night.
Good night. Stay safe.